Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. And my name is Beth Feely. I am with Nurture Neighbors, and I also have my fellow board member, Ted Dabrowski, here. And we are very happy to welcome Bonnie Kerrigan Snyder, and she's here to talk about her book, Undoctrinate, which was just released last week, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And as many of you know, Nurture Neighbors is a group of citizens who advocate for balance and common sense in our schools and the public square. We say our tagline is building community around the ideas of common sense, free enterprise, and the golden rule. We educate our fellow citizens about these ideas through our email newsletters, speaker events such as this. We also hope to do live events soon as we exit, hopefully, some of the COVID restrictions. And you can check us out at nutrineighbors.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there, find out about the latest goings on, and we invite you to do so. One of the areas that we focus on a lot are schools, and we thought having Bonnie talk about this book, which is really designed almost as a parent educational tool, kind of talks about some of the issues that we're dealing with in K through 12 education. They long have been more present on university campuses, but they've moved into the K through 12 realm. And this book has lots of background, but also lots of tips and ideas for parents on what they can do. So just a couple of logistics. Ted and I are we have some questions for Bonnie, so we'll do kind of a moderated discussion here for the next about 20, 25 minutes, and then we would love to get questions from the audience, and so you can submit them through the chat function. We're going to funnel them all through that function just so that we can easily track them, and we will get to as many as we can as the evening goes out, and so we'll wrap up about 7:45. And with that, welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you.
So Bonnie, you are with the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And for those who may not be familiar with FIRE, as it's known, it would be great to get some background on FIRE, your role there, and then how all of that kind of came together with you writing this book, Undoctrinate.
Sure. I have been at FIRE. This is my 5th year. FIRE has been in existence for over 20 years now, and it was founded by FIRE is nonpartisan, proudly, actively nonpartisan. It was founded by a liberal lawyer and a conservative professor who both were very concerned about the climate for free speech and how it was declining on college campuses, specifically over an incident that happened at UPenn over 20 years ago. And since then, FIRE was intended to only be a short-term solution to what they thought was a temporary problem, but the situation has really deteriorated since then to the point where the same sorts of problems now are manifesting in K-12. I did experience them with my own children, well, my younger daughter in particular. I experienced some of them myself, but more in the higher education level. And I am the director of high school outreach at FIRE, and that position was added precisely because we were starting to see that, normally FIRE defends constitutional rights on college campuses, and we will defend, as long as it's protected speech, which means covered by how the First Amendment is written and understood, we will defend whether you're a student or a faculty member, and that's across the political spectrum. We're not currently taking cases at the K-12 level. I think we did just, though, submit our first amicus brief in defense of Mahanoy, the cheerleader case and her free speech rights in school. So we very closely are monitoring what's happening in K-12, and we're very concerned about it.
Great.
But the book, really, I've been working on this book for a number of years, and it derives from, my experiences having this problem with a child in school, which I could explain, but also my own experiences as a trained educator and counselor. I was an English teacher, I was a guidance counselor, and then for about 17 years, I taught developmental psych, and I was a teacher educator in colleges. All on the East Coast.
Hey, Bonnie, I think, we have, some people who will know a lot about this topic and who feel very strongly against some of the things that are going on in the schools.
Yeah.
And then you've got other people who feel equally strongly and think, hey, we should be doing exactly what the schools are doing. But in the research or the reading that I've done, I've seen a lot of people who just don't even know what we're talking about. So the people who know about it are pretty passionate one way or the other. And
Yeah.
then there's a whole bunch of people who just don't know. So I think, can you give us a bit of a setup of why and how this has become so important?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is a situation that has been sort of existing and maybe festering at a low grade level of chronicity. You know, it's been a chronic situation that suddenly has become very acute. During the last school year, I think that there was a new level of openness in terms of heavily pushing, heavy-handed, ideological, agenda-driven curricular changes in the schools, some of which was very overt, some of it was covertly implemented. And that's actually what drove me to pull I had to pull my child out of a school. And it wasn't just that there was one-sided instruction going on, but there was deception taking place as well. And so in that case, I really felt that, you know, not only do I think that this is not a balanced education that you're delivering, but I also think that the means you're deploying in the way that, you know, I caught them lying. And now I just felt like this is not just a bad teacher, but this is, you're kind of a bad person. But these curricula, which you might have heard going by the name CRT, there's been a lot of claims that this isn't happening. I do keep track of these stories, and if you're interested in seeing lists of them, if you go to my website, undoctrinate.org, under the problem, you can probably find, oh, well over 150 of them, I think, that I've collected over several years. And that kind of is the tip of the iceberg, because at FIRE, we hear from parents a lot who are not willing to come forward. I only list published stories there. Things that are blatant enough that the media thinks it's worth running. But I think that the problems that we're hearing about come in a couple of varieties. They come in the lessons that are, maybe you have teachers who are sort of freelancing it and are teaching things that aren't listed in the learning standards for the grade. Sometimes it happens through programming that the school hires that parents aren't even aware about, and the students come home and they're talking about lessons that were imparted that maybe violate the value systems that kids are being taught at home. You know, there are a couple of lawsuits that have been filed recently over the instruction that is taking place in schools. Some of these have gotten a good bit of media attention that fall into the realm of really targeting students. And there are civil rights lawsuits being filed because teachers have, you know, kids are saying that they feel like they're being bullied by their teachers because of the color of their skin or because of their gender. And for other identity attributes. So I keep track of these stories, and I have so many of them at this point that I've started to categorize them, and they go, my categories right now are legal, lurid, lying, unlicensed, and then I just have Lulus, which are just kind of whoppers. And we have this running list at FIRE that you might not see, I guess, if you don't look in certain places where these stories are being published. So if you don't want to hear about them, you probably can avoid them, but it is becoming rather unavoidable within most school systems in America. I think there are still places where it's not happening, but I think in affluent areas, I think in urban areas, I think in suburban areas, it's there.
Can you give us a few details, I guess, on one or two of the stories that really stand out? Maybe one that you thought was perhaps more egregious, and then one where maybe it was a little bit on the less egregious side?
Sure. You know, the one that really got a lot of attention in the last 2 or 3 weeks is the Antifa teacher who was caught on tape bragging about how he has 180 days that he uses to radicalize his students. He uses extra credit, the lure of extra credit, to get them to participate in marches and other events where some of the parents, when they heard about this, are thinking that their kids probably aren't even safe because this is in an area of the country where there's been violence surrounding Antifa. And he also scares the bleep out of them in order to convince them that his views are the correct views. That's probably one of the most radical ones. A more mild one, well, I mean, you had the teacher who went on TikTok. The latest thing I'm noticing is teachers who are sort of bragging about what they're doing, which is an interesting twist. And she went on TikTok and she was giggling about how she took down the American flag in her classroom because it made her uncomfortable, but she hung a gay pride flag. And when the students asked how they could say the pledge, she encouraged them to pledge to the gay pride flag. And I just don't think most parents expect that. And so those are just two examples from the last, 2 weeks, I would say.
Hey, Bonnie, real quick. So one was an extreme one. One was a lady who was willing to go out on TikTok and actually just say it all.
Yeah.
Right now, so I'm always thinking about the people who don't know about these things or don't buy into it.
Right.
What is the more standard, how would I say it, common type of thing? Because for us to be talking about this, it has to be common. It has to be, out there a lot more. So what are some of those more common things that the parents might look for or they might hear about if they're actually listening or watching?
Well, I think that one tip off is maybe to watch if your child is bringing home a lot of worksheets and isn't working out of a textbook as much. A lot of teachers are sort of downloading lessons off of the internet, sometimes from partisan organizations that have created curricula. And these things are not really vetted by the school board, so they're sort of freelancing it, and it's much more loose than what you would expect. So, you're going to be pulling out maybe some questionable lessons from your kid's backpack. I think other things to look out for would be, I think you should ask teachers what learning standards they're aligning their lessons to, because every state has these. And for whatever grade your child is in and subject, if they're in high school, for English 10th grade, there's clear standards that should be met. And, normally these standards are not in the realm of certain attitudes or opinions that a child should hold. So teachers, a lot of it is invisible and it's very difficult to spot because it is sort of a way in which the class is run. It's an expectation that you will agree with me. And if you don't, there was a teacher in California who didn't make it past the first day of school this year. And she literally told her students that if you don't agree with me, you better keep your mouth shut or I'm going to go ahead and make fun of you. She told them that you need to go get vaccinated. She's not a doctor. She's not trained in medicine. She said, if your parents don't want you to get vaccinated, you don't have to listen to them because most of y'all parents are stupider than you are. And then she said, go ahead and tattle on me because the administration isn't going to do anything anyway. So it's this sort of brazen attitude of intimidation coupled with confidence that you are unaccountable to the public, which is really manifested itself quite openly. And I think the fact that there were, COVID caused a lot of this type of digital connection allowed, like the lawsuits that's out of Nevada was the parent overhearing what was going on in the classroom, which wasn't possible. There are a lot of people now who say, just like policemen now have to wear cameras in many places, body cams, who are calling for there to be cameras in classrooms, which is a whole other First Amendment issue. But given what I hear and what I see and understand, I can completely understand why people are asking for that.
So stepping back from some of the examples and what we're seeing today, I know in your book you talk about the problem, kind of how we got here, why it's bad, and then some solutions. So could you touch a little bit on kind of the problem and how we got here? And I'm in particular interested, is there something going on in the way that teachers are being educated that is different from perhaps, a generation or two earlier, the teachers that would have taught us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that incrementally, one thing I have to bear in mind is I went to school in high school in the 1980s and high school and college in the 1980s. And the people who taught me probably were educated in the 1950s, right? And who taught them? It was probably people who were in World War II, who were very patriotic, and it was a very different time. So I think as this generation of teachers is being educated, they are being educated by people who are incrementally more radical. So if you look at the imbalance in academia, it tends to be more skewed in the social sciences, of which education is one. And I have the statistics in the book on how steep that tilt is. The situation in ed schools, and there are two types of ed schools. There are state colleges, like I've taught in a state college where people get an undergraduate degree. Those tend to be less radicalized than the ed schools with a capital ED, which would be places like Harvard Graduate School of Education or Teachers College at Columbia. These places have been radicalized for a long time. Many people would say, specifically Columbia, you know, back to the 1930s with the Frankfurt School that came out of Germany, and that they brought Marxist ideas. And so if you look at, I mean, I Googled, you can go and look at the curriculum at the Teachers College of Columbia, and you're not going to find many lessons there that are going to make teachers very skilled at reading, writing, and arithmetic. Most of them are highly politicized content with a very clear Marxist bent. Probably the most assigned reading among ed schools is from Paulo Freire, and the goal is to raise critical consciousness among the unconscious, which sort of goes along with this idea of critical theory, which is something that I came across back in the 1980s. You know, literary theory was sort of morphing into critical theory, and it's infused, it's a lot of things going on in what they're calling CRT, but you've got identity politics, you've got some neo-Marxism, and, you know, Paulo Freire is an example of the types of readings that today's educators are sort of marinated in. I like to give the example that when I was an undergrad at Harvard, I was assigned the Communist Manifesto 6 times separately. I was never assigned another book more than once. And I did actually drop out of an English PhD program specifically because of the critical theory that I was being asked to participate in. And so when it found its way to K-12, I recognized it immediately, having been exposed to it at the graduate level. So it's subtle and yet very effective. It carries with it a lot of jargon that is fairly impenetrable. Education schools tend to speak in edu jargon, which is a way of making it difficult for parents to penetrate it and to discuss it openly and transparently. But it is so omnipresent at this point that I think it's essential that we learn to either cut through that jargon or familiarize ourselves with enough of it so that we can be very clear about what's going on, because we're talking about minor children who are compelled by law to be in these classrooms. And if there is not open trust between school and home, then I don't see how these institutions can maintain the integrity that is required to continue to receive the support of the public, because it's fading fast. And more than half the states have now proposed or passed laws limiting these sorts of concepts in the schools because of the divisiveness that they tend to engender among, well, within the school community. It seems to be disrupting, interfering with friendship formation, and it seems to violate some of the values that families are trying to impart and traditionally have, you know, for decades now. Very new way of looking at the world, and it doesn't have the buy-in of the community. It seems that the school, I'm also hearing quite a bit of, just the example I gave you, the outright contempt for parents from some of these teachers, which is how they justify withholding and keeping secrets between minor children from their parents, and, you know, openly saying that these parents are dumb and that we have to, I did write an article that was in the New York Daily News where I listed several examples of lack of transparency. And there was one in Philadelphia where in a teacher group, they sort of agreed that what happens in our classroom stays in our classroom, as though this is Las Vegas. But, you know, Las Vegas is not for children, it's for adults. And I don't find that funny.
No. So, I mean, and you have in part 3 of your book, kind of the why it's bad, which you just outlined a couple of the ways. And in the book, you list why it's bad philosophically, pedagogically, ethically, emotionally, democratically, developmentally, and legally. Is there one of those areas that you'd like to kind of touch upon? And then I'd also like to talk about what are some of the solutions, because that's also part of your book.
Yeah, I think that the first, I want to talk about ethically and developmentally. The obvious ethical violations. There are codes of ethics that direct the proper teaching, the proper functioning of the education profession, the same way that doctors live by a code of ethics. And it was so clear to me that teachers were not adhering to these very simple requirements. So I really started there, and I pulled as many codes of ethics as I could find. They exist with the NEA, with the teachers unions. They exist in different disciplinary organizations, such as the National Council for the Social Studies. And then every state has ethical guidelines, as I assume every state. I haven't looked at all 50, but, you know, for example, in Pennsylvania, one of the ethical guidelines that they ask teachers to follow is, before you undertake any action in the classroom, ask yourself, is what I'm doing, whose needs are being met by my action, mine or the students? And the only correct answer is the students. And I do happen to think that a lot of what's going on in the classroom is at the level of the teacher's interests, and is not necessarily developmentally appropriate or pedagogically appropriate. And I go into that in some detail. Developmentally, one aspect of that is the concept of identity development. And there's, you know, one of the worst outcomes is we go through the Ericksonian developmental stages. The identity crisis is very typical of adolescence, and it's answering the question, who am I? And this involves interrogating all of these different values that are out there and different ways of life. And here's what my family taught me, but here's what my neighbors believe in. And you sort of test these out in order to develop your own individual separateness that is your right as a free individual in a free country. And what is happening when we indoctrinate kids, and indoctrinating means to inculcate a doctrine, you know, a dogmatic way of thinking and acting, and, you know, in the same way that a church might. But a church is a voluntary organization that you can join if you decide to make, you know, confirmation, and that's an action that an adult gets to decide whether or not they're going to do. But foreclosure is the terrible outcome that can happen when a child is not even allowed to develop their own identity. And I'm afraid that in some classrooms, their free speech, you know, we recently did a survey at Fire, and we found that now, last year it was 60%. Now we're reaching 80% of college students are saying that they self-censor in school. I have seen data that says in high schools it's getting up towards 60%. So if students can't think freely, if they can't speak freely in school, then they're not learning freely, and they are going to be foreclosed. They never will have explored all of the possibilities, but they're going to have reached conclusions prematurely. So intellectually, it's you know, inadequate for free people. How are we going to solve problems as a society if our young people don't learn to think critically? You know, I want to promote critical thinking, not critical theory.
There was one thing you said in a conversation we had outside of this about there's this weird pull towards unanimity, that somehow that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And actually that there's like, we have to have always consensus, always like everyone agreeing on the direction. And actually really it's healthy debate where you end up with the best result traditionally, and that there's definitely been a bit of a a bit of a slide.
Yeah, no, there is definitely, my husband's a college professor, and he has felt this for a number of years, this demand that there must be consensus or absolute unanimity. And I actually wrote down a quote that I heard after a day or two after the Afghan pullout, where people fell from airplanes, and obviously it was by no means optimal what happened there. And the president came out and said, there has been complete unanimity from every commander on the objectives of this mission and the best way to achieve those objectives. And he said this to reassure the public that, you know, the best minds are on the job. Well, that actually is the exact definition of groupthink that Irving Janis defined in a very well-known article that he wrote, which was a postmortem on the Bay of Pigs disaster. If everyone in the room is agreeing and saying the exact same thing, the chances are that people in that room are censoring themselves. And so it's a phenomenon that tends to happen when you create an environment in which there is pressure to conform. And many students now, and we hear from students, we hear from teachers too, who are being asked to implement things that they know ethically are not optimal and that violate their own consciences against proper teaching of students. And some have resigned. So this is impacting many people in a number of different ways. And, you know, if it's something you haven't come across yet, I would hope that you would investigate it, because you know, there is a reason why half the states are taking action. Whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea, it's not an imaginary phenomenon.
Yeah, Bonnie, you know, I think most of us, especially at Nurture Neighbors, you know, we want to promote, like you said, critical thinking, debate, lots of multiple ideas about things. And, you know, we're not opposed to hearing a lot of the things that are said because, well, those are maybe ideas I don't agree with, but it's fine if our children are exposed to them. What we want to hear is the counter argument or the counter arguments. And I feel like those aren't coming out. And what's hard for people to understand is, you know, there's so much talk of diversity, but when we try to get diversity of thought, it gets shut down. And what really intrigued me was some of the stuff in your book, which had to do with, you know, I've seen a lot of the stuff on the political correctness, on the culturally responsive teaching, where it talks about the systems of oppression and things like that, and the oppressed and the victims. And that part really bothers me, because I always say, hey, you know, I don't think our kids should be taught that. Our kids should be taught that each one of them is an individual that has great capacity and can be nurtured. But anyway, what really struck me was this part about math, and that the belief, let me get to it, you know, that one person's claim that 2 + 2 = 4, and another person's claim that 2 + 2 = blue are both equally valid. Or that, you know, why is a math equation any more valid than a person's feelings? And so, you know, once you start getting to where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, it gets really confusing. Can you expand on that? That's kind of hard to believe within the concept of this thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it is very hard to understand and very hard to believe, which is why I say these theories can be very impenetrable. But what they are taking aim at really is kind of the underpinnings of Western civilization itself, believe it or not. And objective reality is one of those things. Another, you know, I was just having a talk with a college professor who is forming an organization to better teach critical thinking, and we were discussing, you know, emotional reasoning versus logic. And they, you know, people are calling logic white supremacist, and a lot of things have been called white supremacist in the last year. One of my colleagues pointed out, you know, that they called punctuality a form of white supremacy, and he said, well, in that case, I know a lot of black and brown white supremacists, if those are manifestations of it. But it's fine to teach about these ideas. I would personally argue that they are not necessarily developmentally appropriate. I think that there are other concepts that probably should be covered first. I think that there's a lot of just basic foundational factual information that needs to be imparted. I kind of think, I do believe, and I think that these theories are rather esoteric for people who already have a great level of sophistication and background understanding within a certain field. I think these are specializations for very, you know, academic people. I don't think this is an introductory way to first introduce students to many of these subjects. And I think that's part of what's going wrong here. But that being said, you know, FIRE is a free speech organization. We would not try to censor these ideas because we think that ideas need to compete in the marketplace to prove their worth. And if they are bad ideas, then they need to be subjected to criticism. I do think that sometimes these ideas try to wall themselves off from legitimate criticism. And that's another problem, is that, you know, students who, or adults, teachers who try to interrogate them are called names or maybe ostracized, and there are sort of bullying tactics being deployed against them. But regardless of, leave that aside, it's one thing to teach about an idea. It is another to teach it as a worldview that must be affirmed. And this is part of what is happening. And that is something that we would certainly be opposed to at FIRE, because, you know, West Virginia and Barnett, the famous flag salute case, decided for us, and we agree, that there can be no compelled speech in the classroom. So it's one thing to censor yourself where you don't say what you actually think. But sometimes students are being expected to, I mean, we've had students who've been expected to participate in walkouts for causes that they don't believe in, or to, you know, salute or genuflect to ideas that they don't voluntarily affirm. And that is unacceptable and can lead to lawsuits in the First Amendment realm in public school, because public schools are expected to respect First Amendment rights as government, you know, entities of the government.
And what happens sometimes, I think too, it may not even be the teacher creating that environment, it's the peer pressure to participate and to conform, which is a little trickier, I think, to deal with.
Right.
So,
well, I mean, I think of that as skilled teacher. Like one example that I give in the book, and there were many at my daughter's school, and some of them are so unbelievable that it would, I'm not even going to bring them up because it would take a while to even explain how wacky it got at this particular school. But she was given the Communist Manifesto to read, which I am fine with because I think it's a really important book. And then they were expected to sit around a round table and debate whether or not communism was a better system than capitalism. And they weren't given anything to read about capitalism, but the peer pressure was there. Also in my daughter's school, they once a week, they had a meeting that the school's diversity club held. And it was student run, and the teachers just sat back, and you were supposed to stand up if you supported certain causes. Well, the peer pressure was intense, and if you did not stand up, you were targeted for corrective action later in a very Lord of the Flies fashion. And the teachers, I'm quite sure, knew that this was going on and were fine with it. But it's, you know, it's just bullying is what that is.
Yeah, I unfortunately am aware of that happening at New Trier in a slightly different context, but the whole stand on this side, stand on that side, yeah, it probably doesn't end well.
Well, and one of your rights is not to speak. You know, you have the right to remain silent. And but one of the, you know, these DEI firms that are coming in, they are adding this element of accountability, which means not only, you know, at FIRE, we hear from faculty, college faculty, who sometimes will say, I was subjected to this training and I really disagree with it. And our position is that hearing ideas that you might disagree with will not hurt you. But if they ask you to affirm them and to say you agree with them, then that goes too far. And that's where we would draw the line. So that's sort of a guideline, I think, to recommend.
Bonnie, you touched on these DEI firms, these consultants who come into the schools and teach about CRT. Can you expand on that? Because I know it's becoming a huge industry, and you know, I don't really know. It's not controlled. It's hard to know what's going on. I guess we can start FOIAing our schools to find out how much is being spent. But what's going on there?
Yeah, many people are submitting FOIA requests to find out exactly how much is being spent. It is a huge industry, and it is an unregulated industry. So I would say that these consultants vary wildly in quality. And really what you need to get at is, what is the philosophical underpinnings? Where are they coming from philosophically? This is usually opaque. You usually have no idea what messaging they're trying to impart. They will promote or deliver language that sounds as if no one could disagree with it. But when you really drill down, you might find that there are some values that are being imparted that like I recommend that families really think about what it is you believe in and what you stand for, because schools right now might be pushing the limits of where your values, where you draw that bold, stark line, and what is unacceptable to you. And this is a side door through which many of these ideas have entered. And I would encourage you maybe to Google Boston Public Schools unlicensed therapy. I mean, I was trained as a guidance counselor. I have trained guidance counselors. I have taught graduate level classes in group counseling, and I would never attempt to do a group therapy, group encounter session with other children, other citizens, minor children who have not consented to treatment and without parental permission. You have no idea what you're going to unearth, the harm that you can do. And I always point out that, you know, in a public school anyway, teachers are licensed. They're licensed by the state. And the reason they're licensed, just like doctors and just like lawyers or even cosmetologists, is because you're in a position where you can do real harm. And your license is very specific. If you're licensed as an English teacher, you are not licensed as a school counselor. And, you know, just when I was an English teacher, I didn't try to teach math. That's called out of area teaching. And there's a lot of this going on right now. And a lot of people who are imagining that they have competencies that they lack in schools. So really, I personally, as a parent, would not want any unlicensed person in front of my child in school, unless they're there to, you know, provide entertainment. But that's kind of the guise in which some of this, you know, it's an assembly, right? It's an assembly. And then, you know, anything goes? No, it's not a free for all. And this is where the administration needs to uphold standards.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm looking at the time. I would like to move into some of the questions that we've gotten from the participants. Feel free to continue submitting those through the chats. So one question, and then I also want to touch on transparency and as a major form of solution, because I think that's really important. We can do that at the end. So many parents in my town believe this anti-racism curriculum, aka CRT, is instrumental in closing the achievement gap between Black and white students. Is there evidence one way or the other on this? Is anybody studying that and the impact of this type of curriculum, positive or negative? I think you touched upon some of the negative impacts of these types of curricula, but is there evidence that this actually does close some of those performance gaps? Often it's under that guise that much of this type of curriculum gets into a school.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any evidence. I would like to see if there is any evidence. I would have to assume that time spent on affective learning is going to lower achievement on more objective test measures. So if you are concerned about that, I would want to see the test scores. And if they are declining, I think it sort of is in they're arguing that raising the self-esteem is going to raise achievement. Which I have never seen any evidence to verify or validate that. I can't answer that. I would hope that ed schools, that's the sort of research that ed schools should be doing, right? To see if this actually does cause measurable gains in learning. But, you know, part of this ideology, it tends to coincide with anti-test, anti-meritocracy efforts. So that indicates to me that perhaps not.
And then another question is about this trend, or wondering if it's a trend. It was a clip that was seen where a teacher created her own curriculum of inappropriate sexual content, instructed the kids not to tell their parents. Is this a trend, like hiding things from parents? I know we touched on it a little bit earlier, but are you getting calls about this at Fire? And if so, how many?
Oh, we hear from a lot of upset parents all the time, but now there are parent groups. I mean, when I first became aware of Nurturing Neighbors, you were one of the only parent groups I knew of in the country. Now there are so many that I can barely keep track of them. So people all over are hearing from upset parents. I think that this lack of transparency is new. I think that one of the side effects of some of this ideology is that it creates very zealous adherence. And this zealousness sometimes manifests as the confidence that whatever you do in service of this important message that you're trying to deliver is justified. And so I do think that this is new. The key, I think that there have been other ideas that have gone through education that maybe haven't worked out, but I've not seen this kind of secrecy. The secrecy is new. From my perspective, I've seen other bad ideas, and I do happen to think that this is a bad idea myself, at least the way it's often been implemented, but not accompanied with this secrecy, which, I mean, what else do you need to know? I would say too that the medium is the message, and if the medium involves deceit and also bullying, I'm often reminded of, as I listen to some really sad stories and some really broken-hearted and just broken trusted parents, I'm reminded of what Maya Angelou said, which is that people often are not going to remember what you said. They're going to remember how you made them feel. And people do not feel very good about what is going on in the schools right now. I think that having studied a good bit of Marxism in my own education, and I did get education training, there's this saying that the end justifies the means. Well, I'm sorry, but students are autonomous ends in themselves. They are not means to anyone's cherished partisan ends. They are not implements to be wielded for your for your private goals. This is in public schools, absolutely not. They must be respected as the independent individuals that they are, with the right to reach their own conclusions. You can expose them to different ideas, but to expect them to agree with you that's not your role as an educator.
Bonnie, you struck me when you said something. A lot of this theory, from what I've read and what I've seen in your book, is that it's anti-testing, or part of it's anti-testing. It's like, wow. So we're implementing this huge teaching learning program. We're implementing a lot of in places in curriculum, and if it's anti-testing, how do we ever know it's working? How do we start to measure what works? Because typically it's been merits, it's been competence that we've measured, and we've done that through testing. Now we're flipping the model. All
tests are imperfect. I think that another aspect of it, if you've studied as much Marxism as I unfortunately have, is sort of this arbitrary authoritarianness, and the idea that I think that meritocracy there's a centralization of power, and tests enable people to among the groups who are pushing hardest against these new ideologies tend to be immigrants, and tend to be Asians, who rely very much on achievement and effort and meritocratic meritocracy. And so oftentimes what I think we're seeing is these ideas being promoted in often affluent areas where there is a certain amount of what's being called privilege or advantages, and by taking away the meritocracy is the ladder by which the poorer students have traditionally risen. So taking away that ladder really is a very effective means of entrenching privilege, isn't it?
So, and actually in one of the training decks that I've seen, they, from a DEI consultant that was, I think they were in Evanston, said outright that meritocracy is a myth. Just outright. And I think that is, it's uninspiring. It's very disempowering. And I think it engenders, so if it's not meritocracy, then what?
Aristocracy. The opposite of meritocracy is aristocracy. This is where you are born into certain privileges and it's passed down. And I would encourage anyone who is wondering about that to, was it Jason Riley who had that Wall Street Journal article about why meritocracy is worth defending? People who have things handed to them typically don't appreciate them. And I think that there's nothing more satisfying than working hard and achieving a goal and knowing that you earned it and that you deserve it. That's not to say that meritocracy is not perfect. Tests are not perfect. You know who else is not perfect? Human beings are not perfect. And, you know, again, these are some very fundamental Judeo-Christian principles, just the idea of human imperfection, whereas the Marxist mindset tends to believe in utopianism and this idea that we can perfect humans, you know, and I think that's part of where this fervor comes from. It's like, I know the perfect answer where I can perfect you if you would only yield to my demands, that you conform to what I know better than you is the right way to think and to believe. And, you know, anybody who is old enough to have lived through much of the 20th century has seen that these utopian dreams lead to the very opposite of what they promise. You know, this isn't paradise. It's not perfect, but you know, democracy is the best system except for all, or the worst system except for all the others, and maybe meritocracy is the worst system except for all the others, right?
Right.
Or at least it deserves all of these Western ideas, I think, deserve a fair defense. I think they are worth defending, and I think that they certainly deserve to, you know, let's give the devil his due. Let's hear it for Western civilization and the traditional ways that things have been done. Because I'm open to hearing the new ways, and I've sat and read. I've gone to graduate school. I've been very well marinated in some of these theories, but I'm not sure that today's teachers could even articulate, you know, why we have free markets and what the value is, you know, why free speech, which is actually a manifestation of a free market, the free marketplace of ideas. Is you can't separate those two ideas. You know, individualism, why are we an individualistic culture instead of a collectivistic one? You know, there are advantages to collectivistic cultures, but there's a reason why we have a border control problem. And it's not people trying to get out, it's people trying to get in.
Right. Well, and I think New Trier threw down a marker by adopting its critical thinking and civil discourse statement last fall. And so,
yeah, I hope more schools will follow suit. I think that that's an excellent statement. And that's the sort of thing that we encourage at FIRE. And, you know, and these statements are not perfect either, but it's a step in the right direction. And open discourse and rigor and interrogating new ideas is the way forward.
So, all right, well, we're running up against the clock here. I guess it would be great, two things. One, you talked a little bit about transparency, and in the spirit of giving parents some ideas on how to, transparency is really a solution, I think, to some of the problems we've talked about. What can parents do? What words do you have of advice for them as we close this out?
Sure. I think that this problem is so multi-pronged that I think it's going to have to be crowdsourced for solutions, which is why we're, you know, talking to as many parent groups as we can. I think that if you're really concerned about what's going on in your particular child's classroom, you might have to ask for lesson plans in advance. Unfortunately, if you really cannot predict what a certain teacher might do, I think that you need to inoculate your children by learning enough about these ideologies so that you can tell them, look, you might be exposed to these ideas and I want you to understand where they come from, and then debrief them after school. I believe very strongly in supplementing kids. So when you are knowledgeable about what's going on, you will see that there are certain things that used to be included that no longer are. And on my website, undoctrinate.org, I do have some suggestions for supplementation. And at thefire.org/K12, we have lesson plans that are aligned with some national learning standards, things like AP tests, and they're mostly about rights and the First Amendment. And you could certainly download those. They're all free for educators, for administrators, for parents, and you could supplement that way. You could, we have a video also that I would recommend that everyone watch that we put together called The Emperor's New Clothes and Independent Thought. That's just a short video that's made for kids that I think they would all enjoy. But you really cannot leave this to the professionals. I think parents are going to, you know, I think that there's been a lot of trust broken, but there's also maybe been too much complacency on the part of parents. You know, I never went to a school board meeting all the years I was a parent of a K-12 student and when I was a teacher. I don't think I needed to, but I think now parents need to. I know that not everyone can be at every school board meeting, so you probably have to, in communities, form groups like Nurture Neighbors and send somebody and keep and report on it. So I think that the days of blind trust between parent and educators are not going to return anytime soon. I think that maybe the backlash has been a little bit too harsh. I've watched some parents behaving not admirably at some of these school board meetings, and I don't think that's helping. I do understand the anger, but I hope that at school board meetings we can model the type of civil discourse that we want our kids to experience and practice in schools. Yeah, so those are some thoughts off the top of my head, and then there are more in the book, of course. And you know, please send any ideas, because I get some of the best ideas from talking to parents who are living it right now.
Great. And what's the email address that they can reach you at?
You can reach me at highschooloutreach@thefire.org.
Great. And then here is the book, Undoctrinate, How Politicized Classrooms and Harm Our Kids and Ruin Our Schools and What We Can Do About It, available from all the regular suspects, right?
Yep.
And yeah, so we thank you, Bonnie, very much for your time. Best wishes with the book, and it's nice to have you back, and hopefully.
Yeah, and thanks for everything you're doing in Nurture. You guys have really led the way in parent involvement in the schools, and I hope that, you know, as you guys move forward, that there's greater trust and collaboration between school and home, because we want to get back to that.
Agreed. Very good. Okay. Thanks again, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good night.